began. Europe was transformed into a huge battlefield in which millions of soldiers faced each other for 4 years and lived through the hell of trenches, bombings and famines. This war sadly marked history by being the first one that did not spare civilians. It was also marked by the first use of propaganda in a military conflict. The Great War was caused by imperialism, nationalism, militarism and alliances. It was also triggered by the assassination of the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand. It led in 1940 into two alliances, the Triple Alliance with Germany, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, and on the other end, the Triple Entente, France, Britain and Russia. During the First World War, people got informed with newspaper. It offered a way for people to access and escape. Although there was censorship on its content, many people see newspaper as a trustworthy way to get informed. Because of it, we can consider newspaper as a form of propaganda. But people got also informed by letters, which were the main form of communication between soldiers and their loved ones, helping to ease the pain of separation. For fighting soldiers, it was essential to their morale, and England considered delivering letters as important as delivering rations. At the beginning of the war, every letter home was opened and read by a junior officer, and then opened and read at the home depot to make sure that it contains no classified information. At its peak, this incredible operation delivered over 12 million letters a week.
During the First World War, propaganda posters were used to encourage civilians to enlist them on the front lines. This poster was created in London by the Parliamentary Recruiting Committee in 1950. On it, we see a man who is standing. He is well dressed and he is wearing a waistcoat with a British flag on it. He has also a cane on his hand. With all of that, we can recognize John Bull, the fictional representation of Britain. He is pointing at the people who are looking at the poster. In the background, we see men lined up in uniform holding a rifle. They seem ready to fight, and we see that they are needed because of the fire behind them, representing war raging. We can read two lines of text, who's absent and is it you, with you underlined. This poster has a recruiting aim. Indeed, at the beginning of the war, the army was only formed with volunteers. In 1914, it was fine because everybody thought that the war would be a quick victory. But in 1915, when this poster was published, it became obvious that the war would be longer than expected because it required many more men than anticipated. So, this poster has a guilty intention on men who are not enlisted yet, not helping their country in times of need. Today, we know that posters weren't efficient enough because in 1916, the British Parliament imposed conscriptions on all men aged between 18 and 41. Conscriptions means that these men were forced to join the army.
The true birth of cinema did not happen long before the beginning of the war. On December 28, 1895, the Lumière brothers' first public screening of motion picture took place at the Grand Café in Paris. They quickly gave up the idea, and the Pathé brothers took over the industry by creating the world's largest film equipment and production company. The first newsreels were then invented. The cinema became more and more popular throughout the years. In Germany, there were over 1.4 million viewers a day at the outbreak of the war. More and more newsreels and documentaries were created to meet the huge demand of real footage and information from the front line, as it concerned everyone. Everybody wanted to be kept informed about the warfare progression, and cinema suggested an ostensibly more realistic and objective perspective than the newspapers. However, in reality, filming the battlefields usually during night with a heavy light-sensitive camera mounted on tripods wasn't as easy as you may think. In addition, the cameraman had to risk his life out of the trenches to shoot actual combat footage. So only around 10% of the film were actual combat images. The technical limitation of the medium weren't the only break to not showing the battlefields.
Everyone knew someone who was a soldier, and with the development of cinematography, people expected to see the living conditions of their loved ones. As Clémentine said, so many difficulties and aspects stopped real footage from being released. In most cases, actual footage has such minimal action that it could have been shot in Britain. So that's what they did. They shot it in Britain. Staged films got more and more popular around the beginning of the war. But they were quite out of touch with reality. With all of the youth at the front, the only actors available were old men, which misled populations. Even if these films showcased death and violence, these were old men that were dying. So, war was still seen as something glorious. Each country soon realized how useful cinematography was for reaching the masses, since it did it in a very emotional and incomparable way. And soon, each side had their bureau in charge of releasing propaganda films. For example, the British War Propaganda Bureau, the French Cinématographie de l'Armée, the American Committee on Public Information, and the German Bild und Filmat. But the film The Battle of the Somme changed everything. The film became an overnight success, even though some footage had to be faked. The film could not hide the deplorable conditions the soldiers lived in and the toll the war took on the countryside. And for a population that still saw the war as something glorious, this was quite shocking.
To conclude, during the First World War, propaganda was used to encourage people to fight for their country and see the war as the governments wanted them to, in order to convince them more easily.
Letters were very used as it allowed soldiers' family and friends to exchange with men sent away. But every one of them was opened and read to check if no classified information were delivered. Another form of propaganda, more obvious, was the use of posters. Their aim was to convince men to fight because the British Army was only formed with volunteers. To do so, they made multiple posters with different ways to persuade, make people feel guilty, intimidate, make them believe it will be fun, frighten. However, conscription was implemented after the posters' apparent failure. Moreover, cinema, already popular at this time, became an efficient propaganda tool and a new way to get informed because of its supposed more realistic and objective perspective than written news. Nevertheless, most of the films weren't full footage because of the technological, ideological, and military reality. Governments soon realized the great impact those unrealistic films had on the population, and so they decided to release themselves propaganda films. Finally, in showing for the very first time what was really happening on the front, the film The Battle of the Somme changed the glorious vision of the war depicted in the stage films.